What are we making today? I'll give you one quick guess. So, back of the bag oatmeal bread. This is a recipe that I have been making probably 2-3 times a week at least over the past, let's say, 3 or 4 months, actually before the whole lockdown started. So this is a recipe that's really saved our family. It's made some delicious bread. I can't tell you how many countless incredible sandwiches and toasts in the morning that this bread has brought us. So I wanted to share with you guys. Bread can be tricky, but I think in these times bread is something, especially having a good sandwich bread that you can make at home, is such an essential thing to have. So let's start out. This is King Arthur flour. I'm going to link the recipe for this in the description of the video, so don't worry about that, about copying everything down right now. If you notice, I have a mixer. You can certainly do it without a mixer, but a mixer, a dough hook really helps out. Another thing that's essential, really, a scale. I got this at like Marshall's for like $5, I think, like maybe 10 years ago. So you don't have to get the most expensive one. Need to be able to weigh a pound or two of ingredients and you're good. So we're gonna put it on here, tear it out with the bowl. If you remember that from science class. First off, first ingredient. You notice I made this tons of times. I still reference this recipe every single time because I can't remember. So 3 cups unbleached bread flour. So I have bread flour today. And if we notice on King Arthur's recipes, they're really great because they actually list the grams for you. So we have 361 grams. So let me put this in real fast before my scale turns off. It does have a tendency to do that. So gradually going up there, and there is sometimes a slight delay. So I want to make sure I'm not kind of going over too much, so I don't have to put too much back into the bag. And if you think, hey, 360, 363, doesn't matter, let me tell you, this recipe is a pretty high moisture recipe for a standard American loaf. And if I'm going to err on the side of caution, I will go a little bit heavier on the flour, just because this dough tends to be super sticky anyways. So as you see, there we go. So not that much over. We still hit 362, but we're going slightly over. It's fine. And like I said, AP flour, all-purpose flour, perfectly all right. You just won't quite get, I don't think, as strong of a secondary rise. You may see some slight differences in texture in the way the bread holds together, but it's still going to make great sandwiches. So tear this thing out. Let's see if it works for me this time. There we go. Back to 0. Rolled oats. We have here Quaker Old Fashioned. I've used Quaker 1 Minute, basically whatever I can get at the store. But any kind of plain oats, perfectly all right. So going to go 99 grams here of those old-fashioned rolled oats. Okay, well, hit 100. Like I said, that's okay on the dry ingredients. I rarely go slightly over, maybe 1 gram over at the most is kind of my tolerance on those things. Next up, 28 grams of butter. So again, gonna zero this guy out. There we go, switch back to grams. Unsalted butter. I always try to bake with unsalted. Salted butter is fine. The problem is all salted butters kind of have a slightly different salt level, so it's really difficult to guess how much more salt to add back in. And with things like baking, that can be really tough. It can really mess up your recipe. And we'll talk about that in a second here when we get to the salt and the yeast here in the end. So 7 grams already. 12. 18. 25, 29. So that's fine. Within 1 gram, we'll be good on the butter. Okay, what's next? 1.5 teaspoons salt. So let me grab the salt here. This is just Morton's kosher. You're welcome to use sea salt, whatever you got around. Just don't use iodized, you know, no iodized salt in baking or cooking. So 1. And if you're tempted to say like, you know, I don't like my bread salty, I'm gonna add less. Don't do that, especially in a yeast bread, because the salt not only adds a ton of flavor to your bread, but if you don't put enough salt in your bread, the yeast is going to get really carried away. And so the salt really kind of helps keep the yeast at bay, and the recipe has been balanced for the amount of salt and the amount of yeast it has. So make sure you're kind of following those guidelines really strictly. So here we have an option here. We can either add 40 grams of brown sugar or 63 grams of honey. I like my bread with honey. Choose what you like. So just got some honey here, and I try and go, this is kind of how you can dial in the sweetness the way you like it to some extent. Again, these simple sugars like this is great yeast food, so you don't want to mess around too much with these sugar levels, but I just try to make sure I hit 60 here on the yeast. Whoop, 63, here we go. And that's actually right on recipe. So now we have 2 teaspoons yeast. So this has been interesting. Yeast, I'm using instant. This is the best kind of yeast. You should always buy instant, easiest to work with. You can buy the regular yeast if you can't find instant right now, but instant I can just add right in here. If I had regular yeast or active dry yeast, you'd have to bloom it in the milk, which is our liquid for this recipe, which we're going to add later. Extra step, takes extra time. Instant works perfectly all right, and that's what your recipe calls for. I would try and get it. As you notice here with my instant yeast is in this funny deli container. Guess what? Because yeast is sold out. So I had to get it from bulk in a deli container, but it works great. Keep it in the fridge. So 2 teaspoons yeast. So just make sure we get 2 level teaspoons. Sprinkle it in the bowl here. Okay. And then the only other ingredient we have to add here is our 1 1/4 cups, or I measured this 283 grams. I'm using whole milk, and I'm going to add that in to the mixer as it's mixing. It's really kind of the best way. So you're going to see here, let me pull this out, how sticky kind of a dough this is. So the first thing I'm going to do, obviously lock my mixer in, turn it on to low, and I'm just going to go around the edge here, if you can see that, and just pour down carefully around the edge, just trying to make sure all of the dry bits get incorporated. So all I'm doing is just trying to prevent a bigger mess when I have to stop this in a second and scrape the bowl anyways. With this recipe, you're gonna have to scrape the bowl no matter what, so this is just gonna kind of help us a bit. And so that's probably about as good as it's gonna do on its own for this first little step. And so I just scrape down my dough hook and just kind of get the sides. You'll see some bit of flour stuck. You see a bit more flour on the bottom. So sometimes I'll just take this off too. And then just make sure you have a spatula handy. You could do it with a spoon as well. And look at all that flour on the bottom. There's maybe a tablespoon or 2 there that didn't get mixed up initially with those dry ingredients or with the wet when I added them. And the problem is if you just left that and didn't do this step that I'm doing right now, you're going to end up with all of that dried flour at the bottom in the end. So just taking a second and just kind of making sure we're getting it all mixed up by hand there is going to save you a lot of trouble in the end. So again, scrape this back off. And you know, if you guys don't have a stand mixer, I know times are tight right now, but I really recommend getting one in your kitchen. It's so useful. I've had this guy for, I don't know, probably about 18 years, 19 years. So I'm gonna let this guy go. A little bit more like this, 5 minutes, and I'll see you then. All right, so 5 minutes has gone by. You can kind of see this dough is really come together. It's still a little bit sticky on the bottom. You see it's kind of like not fully come into like a ball. So at this point, what I'm going to do now, since I've mixed it for 5 minutes already, kind of on a low speed, take it off the bowl again. I'm going to go ahead and scrape the sides just like this, just to kind of make sure that we are getting it fully mixed and we don't have that little part right here that's getting stuck to the bottom. So don't worry about it looking a little sticky, because this dough is a very sticky dough. So we're just going to scrape those sides and then put it back in the bowl, lock it, and then I'm going to kind of put it onto a higher speed and we'll let that go for 2 minutes. Alright, so now you can really see how the dough is pulled up from the bottom now that we've kind of been mixing it at this higher speed. You see it, there's kind of far less sort of sticking in there. So I'm pretty good, I think, with the way it's looking right now. I think we got enough formation. It's pulling away from the sides really nice. It looks nice and clean. Again, look how it's kind of climbing up that dough hook. That's another good sign. So I'm just gonna scrape, and actually, you know what, before I even scrape this, one of these things, if you don't have them, olive oil. This is just like a little like hand pump spray thing. It's fantastic. You just pump it like this, pumps air into there, and you put whatever oil you want. In this case, just olive oil. And I can kind of grease a little bit the bottom of this bowl. So this recipe, I'm not really using like any flour or anything like that to keep the bread from sticking. The thing that I'm using to keep this bread from sticking to everything is just oil. And that's really great because it allows the dough to stay moist, because when you're adding actually extra flour to try and keep things from sticking, you're actually making the dough less moist. So it's actually going to kind of really, or has the effect, or it can, if that flour gets mixed in, of really changing the texture of your bread. So I'm going to take it and just kind of make sure we're not stuck on the bottom here. And then what I like to do is kind of grab it up out of here, sort of in the way that I already did. Take it, and then just, it's going to be a little sticky on your hands. That's okay. If you have the right consistency, it should just barely kind of come off your hands without sticking. And so I make this nice little ball like this. Again, hit that very bottom. And then what I'll do is I'll just put the dough into the bowl, kind of spray the top. Okay. Looks like a lot, but this thing really atomizes that olive oil, so you're not getting very much on there at all. If you're worried about the flavor, you're really not going to get any flavor from the oil on the finished product. It's not going to be greasy. Wrap it up and just leave it like that in a warm place for about 1 hour. It's around 74 degrees in here, which is really kind of perfect for dough, I have found, and we'll see you in 1 hour. All right, we're back. It's 1 hour later. As you can see, our dough is nice and puffy. So we're gonna save this plastic wrap over here to the side for a second. Now, I'm gonna bake this guy in a large loaf pan. These things are great. I mean, indestructible. I think this brand is Nordic Ware. You can get these, I think I actually saw this at Super Target, but online's great too. These differ slightly in sizes. This is like, I think, a large is typically considered 9x5. This one I think is like 9.5 by 5.25 or something goofy like that. It works great. The most important thing in this is you want to make sure that you're not going to get a loaf of bread that won't fit in your toaster. So that fits in my toaster, so works for me. So one of the most important things here to ensure that you're going to get a nice even rise is what you're going to do to this dough and the way we're going to wrap it up and get it into our loaf pan. So what I'm going to do first here is I'm going to line the loaf pan with some parchment, just regular old parchment paper. And this is really all I do to make sure that the loaf just slides out nice and easy. I don't grease it, I don't butter it, I don't do anything to it. I just line it with parchment. It's really just the easiest thing to do when baking, I find, at least with breads. I don't like cleaning up stuck bread on pans. So it's not perfect. I just want to make sure that I'm kind of covering up most of the metal surfaces. I kind of fold it over a bit, but that's your basic idea. That'll be good enough. Now I'm going to pull out one more piece, and this is going to be for rolling out the bread or the dough at this point. So put that like that. So at this point, I mean, we've already kind of greased this. Another kind of great thing about letting the dough sit is that it's going to hydrate more. The flour is going to be more hydrated, so it shouldn't be too tacky. If it's a little too tacky, you can spray this down again with a bit of oil, olive oil, or any kind of neutral oil would be great, or the top of it. So that's not the case. You can kind of see this is easily coming out. So I'm just going to more or less make the top part right now is facing down, and this part that's now facing up was what was in the bowl on the bottom. And I like to keep it that way. I find that that's going to make the best, most even, consistent loaf. And you see that, you know, I can tell the gluten is nice and rested. I'm pressing it and it's not coming back on me. And basically I'm just going to make this thing into, I mean, roughly this kind of rectangular shape. I don't know if you can really tell too much, but that's probably, you know, a little bit, maybe an inch or two taller than a regular sheet of paper, and probably a couple of inches wider than a regular sheet of paper on each sides. Again, it's not super crucial that this is perfect, but this is the way that I have kind of found. I was trying to and make sure that it is kind of as even as possible. And then I'll take one side and just roughly kind of fold it to the middle, okay? And then I'll take the next side and again just kind of knead it. I'm not overlapping or anything like that. I'm not really even worried about, you know, exactly how even it is. I knead up the two sides, and then what I do with this end right here, and you know, this is the way that I roll this loaf. If you talk to, you know, 10 bakers, you're gonna get 10 different ways to roll a loaf. This is the way I do it. This is the way it works for me. I've literally been doing this 3-4 times a week for the last few months, and this has been the most effective method. So I just kind of start to roll it over in on itself, and as I'm rolling it, I'm tucking in with my pinkies. I don't know if you can see that, but I'm tucking in and sealing in this part, and then these fingers are kind of punching down the middle, right? So sealing with my pinkies, punching down in the middle, okay? And then, you know, don't worry if you're not doing this like super fast at first, but we're basically making this kind of, you know, I'll get to the end, put it back, but we're making this sort of, again, kind of pinching, rolling in like this, and then the thumbs kind of come down, but it's making this sort of submarine, you know, kind of shape. And it's important that I really kind of want these ends, you know, kind of tucked in a little bit. It's just going to help in the way that your loaf is going to look eventually. And then kind of what I'm doing here is I'm just kind of filling to make sure that I didn't create any air pockets or big air pockets. And then I just kind of want to make sure that I have this uniform shape. So if you guys can kind of see that, I don't know how well this is going to kind of come up at this angle, but you have this sort of torpedo shape that's going to form a nice, beautiful loaf. So once I put it into my pan, you can sort of see there that how much room we have for expansion. You know, we're about, you know, really close, almost touching the sides, and maybe, you know, half an inch or so, 3/4 of an inch on the top and the bottom right here away. So that's it for that step. I like the shape of that. Let's come back in approximately an hour. You know, it says to do the second rise for up to an hour and a half. This is really going to depend on how warm your kitchen is, if you already have the oven going, all that kind of stuff. Today in here, as I said before, it's about 74. And so I know that in about maybe an hour 15, I'm going to try and get this guy in the oven. So the thing that's important about this step, now we've let it rise for an hour and we're doing the wash. We have this nice even crown. It's about, I'd say, an inch or so over the pan. So that's about what you want to look for. Now I'm doing just a wash right now with whole milk. You can do the egg wash, which is in the recipe. You can do no wash at all. What I've found though is when you do no wash at all, you tend to get a bit more of kind of darker spots, ironically, where just doing the milk kind of helps it be more even brown. If you do the egg wash, you're going to get the deepest, kind of nicest, evenly brown crust, but it also does impart a slight flavor component, which I don't like to have in my sandwich bread. It tastes almost more like that kind of crust you get with the pastry. So I found the whole milk wash is kind of the simplest, and it sort of prevents from those darker brown spots happening and getting a more even brown. Now what you could do if you wanted to make it look like the picture is do a sprinkling of oats now over the top. I find that looks really nice when it bakes up in the oven, but the issue is when you're using this bread on a daily basis as a sandwich bread, it creates the most horrendous mess all over your counter. So I leave it plain. In a bakery or something, it'd be nice to have that topping just so you could tell what it is, but I think in this setting in the home, not having the crust or the sprinkling of the oats rather makes it far more manageable. So we've got the oven set now to 350. This is going to go in for 26 minutes, and then after 26 minutes I'm going to tint it with some foil to keep it from over browning. Okay, so 26 minutes has gone by. Let's take a look at this bread. Nice and golden on the top, so I'm going to tint it with the foil here just to keep it from over browning, and then we'll let that go for another 12 minutes. Okay, timer's up, moment of truth. Let's take out the bread. And look at that. Perfectly golden brown. And this is something kind of interesting that I've noticed with this flour that I've been using, and you'll kind of notice this and sort of get to know your flours better, but you see how the bread split right here? I kind of like it, the random splits. It sort of makes it, to me, look like more artisanal. You can control where it's going to split if you use like a razor or just a really, really sharp paring knife, and you can kind of do a split across the top or even multiple. But this is something interesting that I've only noticed happen with this one specific flour that I've been using. Typically I use King Arthur, which I haven't had any splits at all in this loaf until I started using a generic flour from H-E-B, which all their stuff is always super high quality. It definitely hasn't resulted in any differences in the texture of the bread, which I'll show you once this loaf cools down. But it's just interesting to see how I typically get these splits with this flour, so that's something that I'd love to investigate in the future and see what are the differences in these flours. Is the protein level? Is there something different about the gluten level that causes these types of things to happen? So I'm going to let this cool down in the pan for just a couple of minutes, and then I'll pull it out here and place it onto the rack and let it continue cooling the rest of the way. I really like to wait until the loaf is totally cooled before I slice into it. And that typically, for something like this, is going to take about an hour for this loaf to finally totally cool down, so when you slice into it, you're not just seeing loads of steam come out. And that's really important, to really let the loaf cool down before you slice into it, because you want what's called the crumb, that structure, to really set up in the loaf. Here we have it. Finished loaf. So using a bread knife, this is essential, and give you a little bit of a tip for technique on cutting this guy. So what we want to do is I like to kind of hold the bread like this and then sort of look down at this kind of top angle on the bread, and I'll kind of like slice off a small slice right here just to get that heel off, right? If you're doing a classic American sandwich slice, right, you don't really necessarily want that. So I'll go in here, and the great thing about making your own bread is, guess what? You get to decide how thick or thin that you want it. So there you go. You can see the structure. of the crumb here, kind of based on how we rolled it. You can kind of see that swirl. You see these tiny little pockets. You see this nice little crust, you know, on the bread, kind of all the way around. And that's something that definitely you want to see in a finished sandwich loaf, right? You don't see any major scrunched up parts, right? A little bit down here, but that's just because this is on the very, very heel of the loaf. But as you look at this, you're going to see some really nice structure. You can kind of see how springy this loaf is, and that's all there is to it. You are now deputized to make amazing sandwich bread at home.